Hey guys, welcome to This Week in Health Tech. We're covering a few stories that I thought were particularly interesting for folks who are building, investing, or operating at the nexus of healthcare and technology. Our stories this week: tariffs on generic medicines, a loony FDA hearing on peptides, and the disappearing act of the great generational wealth transfer. But first, a shout out to our sponsor, Populate. Populate is the AI operating system for private medical practices that treat muscles, bones, joints, and tendons. The platform offers ambient scribing, AI billing recommendations, RCM services, an AI voice agent, and reimbursable monitoring programs to make sure your front office and back office can run at light speed. Practices can grow without increasing headcount, with a fraction of the administrative burden required from staff. You can check it out at populateemr.com. Our first story, it's Liberation Day for the generic pharmaceutical industry. This week on Truth Social, the president announced a proposed tariff regime for generic pharmaceuticals manufactured outside of the United States. Starts at 0% for the first 2 years, and then jumps up to 100% the year after, and then 200% the year after that. Generics represent something like 90% of the volume of prescriptions filled in the US, but only about 12% of the prescription medication spend. This is an industry with pretty razor-thin margins, and so pressure from tariffs would make it difficult for manufacturers to operate and could push some of them out of the industry altogether. Now, you might read this as a negotiating tactic or posturing, because ultimately it would take several years for the U.S. to establish robust domestic manufacturing capabilities for generic pharmaceuticals at scale. The market seems to think that might be the case, with the initial sell-off, and the gradual retreat of that sell-off suggests that the market thinks that that's probably the case. Or maybe this is another situation that's going to get tacoed in a week or two from now. But broadly, we see a clear mandate from this administration to reshore critical industries, and that includes the manufacturing base around healthcare and pharmaceutical products. As the United States jockeys with China for leadership of categories like biotech and pharmaceuticals, this is just another part of that battle. Ultimately, I see this as a tailwind for companies like CDMOs that are investing in capacity. And these tailwinds around pharma manufacturing should make this industry even more investable over the coming 2 or 3 years. Our next story takes us to the brewing battle over peptides. Last week, the FDA convened its Pharmacy Compounding Advisory Committee, the PCAC.
I am a peacock! You gotta let me fly!
They met to decide whether 7 peptides should get easier access to a legal compounding pathway. It's helpful to understand the timeline of how we got here. In 2023, the Biden administration put 19 peptides on a do not compound list, citing safety concern. This April, the FDA pulled 14 of those substances off of that do not compound list. In June, the FDA announced a reconstituted PCAC, which was basically packed with industry insiders conflicted by ties to the peptide industry. The next day, the FDA's own staffers put out their recommendations suggesting not to make it easier to compound these. Last week, the panel rejected the recommendations of FDA staffers and voted to suggest the authorization of compounding for 6 of the 7 peptides. Now, let's be clear. None of these peptides were suggested to be approved because of safety and efficacy data. To emphasize this point, FDA staffers in the discussion raised a really simple point, which is that they cannot chemically characterize what these substances even are. And despite that, you had panelists like David Pope saying it's time to put this decision in the hands of the patient, the physician, and the pharmacist. What we're seeing here is essentially proponents laundering peptides in the language of harm reduction. Think about programs like drug needle exchanges or letting ravers test their drugs at festivals. The idea is you can't stop the bad behavior, so let's, create a safer way for people to do that. With peptides, it's, they're buying this stuff on the gray market anyway. Why don't we make sure that there's a safer access to the stuff that they're buying? But there's a pretty big difference here. Harm reduction applies to a situation where you can't stop the behavior, not to a situation where you're actively pushing and propagating the behavior. Why are people going to the gray market to buy peptides to inject themselves? Well, maybe it's because people on this very panel are posting on social media about how if you're feeling a little bit hungover, you can inject some peptides and enter God mode. Essentially, the problem is if you take harm reduction language and logic and apply it to a drug approval pathway, then you're taking out the most important pieces of that drug approval pathway, which is it safe and does it work? It's irresponsible to make medical freedom the operating principle of the healthcare system. And we're seeing what happens when you do that. America is about to lose its measles eradication status, with cases already surpassing the level of all of last year halfway through this year. The frustrating thing is, if you look at the medical establishment, there's tons of flaws with it, and opponents are right to kind of pick out what some of those are. I mean, just this week, you're seeing the diaries of Anthony Fauci come out, and it's clear he's an egomaniac who is super stoked to be in the news all the time. And this is the same establishment that presided over the genesis of the opioid epidemic. But what these folks are asking you to do is trade a system that can be abused for a system of abuse. And they want to use that system essentially to shill unproven products onto desperate consumers. Our final story this week, dude, where's my inheritance? There's a story out from the Washington Post this week that calls into question one of the big narratives around the market and economy in general. For years, we've talked about the generational wealth transfer, right? That baby boomers now represent over half of U.S. household wealth. And theory was that, well, at some point, that's going to be transferred on to the next generation. What the Washington Post article calls out is that due to high costs of senior care, that might not be the case. And a lot of these inheritances that folks are counting on maybe could evaporate. Consider the numbers. Median assisted living now runs over $60,000 a year, and memory care runs closer to $80,000 a year. And these costs are climbing 3 to 4% a year. The sequence for how these inheritances are getting wiped out kind of goes like this. Imagine a person with $1 million in savings, pretty good nest egg and something that maybe the next generation is counting on. But let's say this person now needs to go into assisted living. Well, suddenly that savings starts to wind down pretty quickly. They can't get any assistance until they basically exhaust those savings and land on Medicaid. An analysis from the Urban Institute found that more than 4 in 5 middle-class people over 65 who need long-term care end up on Medicaid. And almost half of upper middle-class couples, that's folks with lifetime earnings north of almost $5 million, end up on Medicaid too. Like so many stories around medical cost inflation, this could have ramifications well beyond the confines of healthcare. Definitely one to watch. Thanks for tuning in. Catch you guys next week.